on the Matchroom website. She was meant to fight this weekend. I thought she could be here today. What's the latest on that?
September the 11th, it looks like, in Spain. We've had a bit of a problem with the red list countries. Savannah Marshall's opponent was also from a country in Africa, I can't remember, that went on the red list, and obviously Mexico went on the red list as well. So both of them will fight in September.
And then the US card, is that announced this week? Do we have
Yeah, September the 18th will be announced this week, and we're finalising that now.
That excerpt comes to us by way of Seconds Out. Very recently spoke to Eddie Hearn, who shed some insights, shed some light and some clarity on what the situation is with Tasha Jonas and Savannah Marshall. Why aren't they making an appearance on the Fight Camp series, since there are widespread rumors circulating that perhaps they have left Matchroom, they have parted ways, and they're going to be boxing on Sky from here on out?
Apparently not.
According to Eddie Hearn, the reason that neither Savannah or Natasha boxing in the Fight Camp series is due to the fact that they experienced some issues with their opponents who were traveling from abroad.
Red-listed countries.
COVID-19 pandemic, all that jazz.
So I guess that means they're still on Matchroom.
And their next ring appearance will be under the banner in September. Who against? That has yet to be determined. That has yet to be announced. Specific to Natasha Jonas, who's rumored to have very recently signed to Matchroom, you know, there's been some things going on at 140 pounds. Christina Lenarda, too, very recently vacated her WBO title. That title was going to be on the line in the McGee versus Bustos fight, but Mary McGee, she's out injured, and Jessica Camara is going to be standing in her place for that WBO title, that vacant WBO title, against Victoria Bustos. And, you know, I thought to myself, I said,
What do you say?
You know, I'd like to see the winner of that fight Natasha Jonas. I don't see why that can't happen.
I like Jessica Camara on points.
To win the Bustos fight and thereby become the newly crowned WBO 140-pound champion. I like Jessica Camara's chances.
Even as a late replacement.
I think she's got everything it takes to beat Victoria Bustos, and I think that Jessica Camara has hit her stride. She's coming off a career-best win over Heather Hardy, and I think that that momentum will lend itself to Jessica Camara's performance. I like Jessica to win the fight, and I think that
beyond that fight,
Jessica's supposed to be in action against Victoria later on this month. Following month, in September, that's when Natasha Jonas' next fight is supposed to be. Likely it'll be a rebound fight, so she can rebound off that recent loss to Katie Taylor. Beyond that,
they could make a fight between them.
Hell, the winner of the fight doesn't even have to be Jessica Camara. If by some chance Victoria Bustos proves me wrong and she wins that WBO title, they can make Victoria Bustos versus Natasha Jonas. In any event, I don't see why Natasha Jonas can't square off against the winner of this fight in the winter months or early next year. All the titles in the super featherweight division, they're all tied up right now. Champions themselves, they're preoccupied, so there's not much chance of Natasha getting a crack at one of them. In the lightweight division, well, she's already fought Katie Taylor, and Katie's got all the belts, so the next best thing is to vie for a title in the women's 140-pound division. And given Natasha Jonas's punching power, pedigree, and physical dimensions, I think that she'll fit right in at 140 pounds. I mean, look at Victoria Bustos, look at Jessica Camara. These are fighters that have no recorded knockouts.
They're good fighters.
Don't get me wrong, they are, but neither one of them has ever exhibited the kind of punching power that Tasha exhibits at any weight. Victoria Bustos wasn't a big puncher at 135, and she's not a big puncher now at 140. The same applies to Jessica Camara, whereas Natasha Jonas not only comes from a very solid amateur background, but she's always been a bigger puncher than these two girls comparatively.
I like Natasha's chances against either one.
And I think the next logical step for Natasha Jonas once she rebounds in September is to make the fight between the winner of Bustos versus Camara for that WBO title. You want to get a title in Natasha's hands and integrate her into that 140-pound division, that 140-pound championship scene, where Chantel Cameron, her stablemate, holds the WBC, Mary McGee holds the IBF, Kaylee Ruiz holds the WBA, and very soon, Jessica Camara could end up holding the WBO.
Natasha would fit right into that picture.
After September. Don't know who it is Natasha's going to be fighting or where. Don't know if it's going to be a lightweight contest or a super lightweight contest. But beyond that rebound fight, because that's what it is, the next logical step is to have Natasha Jonas fight the winner of that fight for that WBO title. Let's see if it happens that way. In other news, boxing scribe Steve Kim took to Twitter to react to the recent events that have unfolded in the welterweight division. And he was quoted as saying, Ugas is a solid welterweight, but let's be blunt. We wanted Pacquiao versus Spence. It was the best, most high-profile fight of the summer #boxing schedule, and he's right. This was supposed to be that summer blockbuster.
Everybody was all ready to see this fight.
You know, it's tantamount to anticipating a steak dinner, getting your mouth all ready for it, you're salivating, and you end up eating pizza instead.
Chinese.
Get yourself all hyped up to chomp down on a sirloin steak, and you end up eating chicken chow mein instead. It's just not an adequate substitute. It's not the same thing. And even though it's great,
Having Ugas stand in.
and he is an active reigning world champion, the fight just doesn't have the same luster, the same intrigue, the same sizzle. Manny's gonna be fighting for a belt that they never should have taken from him in the first fucking place.
Yeah, that's how this reads to some people.
The WBA was a lot more Johnny on the spot to take that belt away from Manny Pacquiao than they were with Keith Thurman, who sat out for all of 2 years, close to it. They aren't that Johnny on the spot with Leo Santa Cruz, who hasn't campaigned as a featherweight in 2 years, but he's still WBA champion there.
They were a lot quicker to take that title away from Manny than those guys.
That's how this reads to some people. Manny's set to fight for a title that should have never been taken from him in the first place, in a fight that doesn't have the same luster, the same intrigue, the same sizzle as the Spence fight. Kevin Ioli of Yahoo Sports tweeted, I just spoke to Freddie Roach. He said when Manny Pacquiao found out that Errol Spence Jr. was out and Yordenis Ugas was in, Pacquiao said, get some right-handers in the gym and let's get to work. Biggest takeaway from what Roach said is that he believes Ugas likes to go for the home run shot, and that opens him to counters. I've watched 2 of his fights today. When I go home tonight, I'll watch more, and I'll have the game plan all set for tomorrow.
And that's why Manny Pacquiao's an all-time great.
Win, lose, or draw. Not that I know or presume to know how this fight is going to end. I don't. I haven't even started wrapping my mind around the aesthetic of this match and what it's going to look like as opposed to what the Errol Spence Jr. fight would have looked like. I can't even begin to tell you.
Oh, I don't even know if I'm going to buy it or not.
I haven't decided because Pacquiao versus Ugas is an intriguing fight, but is it the kind of fight that should cost the consumer $80? $80 a pop?
Wrestling with the idea of buying this fight.
I mean, it is still Manny Pacquiao after all, and let's be honest, the driving force for this fight really was Manny Pacquiao more than Errol Spence Jr. Though with Errol Spence Jr.'s absence, the fight has lost some of its luster.
I mean, it's not as exciting, is it?
I don't know, maybe I'll buy this thing.
But how many of you out there are going to buy this thing?
That's the question. What's the buy rate for this fight going to look like now? What does this recent turn of events, unexpected, what does this do to...
You're not going to do with Ugas what you would have done with Spence.
Modest estimates. I don't know, maybe 250, maybe 300,000, maybe 350,000. I mean, this is Manny Pacquiao we're talking about. And his name has retained a lot of marquee value over the years.
Maybe it does 400,000.
Whatever it does end up doing, what I don't think it'll end up doing is the same numbers it would have done if Errol Spence Jr. were still involved, if Errol Spence Jr. didn't have to pull out as a result of that eye injury.
You won't do with Yordenis Ugas what you would have done with Errol Spence.
Call me crazy, but I feel like there's a pox on PBC. They've been the common denominator with a lot of things that just aren't happening. You know, arbitrator ruled, and Deontay Wilder, Tyson Fury was supposed to fight, and then that fight ends up getting delayed. They couldn't reach a deal for the Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant undisputed super middleweight title fight. Here we see another fight set to happen on PBC's Isolation Island that's riddled with problems.
And they're the common denominator.
They are the constant throughout.
The boxing community's divided on the matter.
There is division. There's a cross between an outpouring of sympathy and well wishes for Errol Spence Jr. and on the other side of the aisle, a lot of people that are very distrustful of the PBC. They don't actually think Errol Spence Jr. is injured, and what they think this is a play to get Manny to stay on the island for 2 fights instead of just 1.
Yeah, people are divided on this whole thing.
So it's all the same, any way you slice it. No Pacquiao versus Spence in a little over a week's time, and it is a great disappointment for the sport and a letdown, another letdown, big letdown in the sport of boxing.
First, it was no Joshua versus Fury.
And that turned into no Wilder versus Fury, no Canelo versus Plant, not yet.
No undisputed in September.
It's hard to be a boxing fan these days under these circumstances in this part of the world, as the issue seems to be mostly
PBC related.
and there are questions, serious questions ahead of this fight. And, what happens moving forward? I mean, if Manny Pacquiao beats Yordenis Ugas and reclaims that WBA title, what does Manny do after that? Because the story's supposed to be he's running for president next year. So what does he do? Does he try to squeeze in another fight before the end of this year? Will Errol Spence Jr. be ready to fight in 2021? Or will he have to sit out longer than that as a result of the injury?
He said he'll be back.
And he said he'll face the winner. Spence is being quite optimistic, but just how long is that going to take? What's the extent of the injury?
How long is he going to be out?
And if he comes back, by the time he comes back, should Manny Pacquiao be the one that emerges the victor?
How do we know Manny don't retire by then?
I'll tell you what I think. It's going to look mighty suspicious to a lot of people if Errol Spence Jr. manages to make a ring appearance before this year is out. Because then people are going to start to question the severity of this injury, if it was even real, and if this wasn't all just a play to get Manny to stay on the island for 2 fights instead of just 1. And finally, per tweet from Michael Benson, Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Charles Martin is now reportedly possible for October. Martin now trained by Manny Robles, who Ruiz Jr. split with after the Anthony Joshua defeat, according to ESPN Knockout. What do I think about this news? Well, it's a decent fight depending on how it's billed.
Is this a pay-per-view?
Or is this an addition to a bigger card? It all depends on how the fight is structured. If this is the main event for a pay-per-view, then it's not a good fight. You shouldn't have to pay $80 to see this. But if it's on the undercard of a bigger fight that could perhaps go down in October, then it's a good addition.
Canelo versus Plant, for example.
We know that the talks broke down, and we know that the talks have resurfaced. We know that the Plant fight on Fox is being revisited by the Canelo Alvarez people, who are looking to come back in either late October or early November. Hypothetically speaking, if this fight is a part of that fight, a part of that card, then it's a good addition.
Yeah, to the undercard.
To my original point, it's a decent fight depending on how the fight's being billed. Is it being billed as a part of a bigger card, or is it being billed as a standalone event, the main event, to a pay-per-view? It all depends on how the consumer gets to see it. We know that Charles Martin very recently was campaigning for a potential Dillian Whyte fight in the United States, and we know that Dillian Whyte himself had no interest in fighting Charles Martin, but he did have an interest in fighting the former unified champion, Andy Ruiz. So for Charles, it's a good fight.
It's a good fight for Andy, too.
But it's a fight that still accents the same aversion to a Dillian Whyte fight. It seems that Andy Ruiz Jr. rather fight a lot of guys aside from Dillian Whyte, who hoped to fight Andy Ruiz here in the United States in the immediate future. It's not that Ruiz versus Martin is a bad fight, it's just that it's not Ruiz versus Whyte. They made Andy Ruiz Jr. an offer last year to do the fight when he was still rebounding off the loss to Anthony Joshua. Andy, he didn't take them up on that offer. You fast forward a year, the same interest is expressed, but once again, Andy Ruiz, he'd rather do something else with someone else.
I mean, what's the excuse now?
Last year, the situation was a little different. Andy Ruiz, he was still coming off that loss to Anthony Joshua. The COVID pandemic was raging. He had just paired up with Eddie Reynoso.
So maybe last year wasn't the best time to do that fight.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't, but what about this year? This year, Andy Ruiz is all settled in with Team Reynoso, and he's had a fight. He's back in the winner's bracket. He has since rebounded off that loss to Anthony Joshua, and still,
No Dillian Whyte fight, huh?
make of that what you will. For Charles Martin, this is a golden opportunity to breathe life back into his career with what could be a stellar victory over Andy Ruiz Jr., who was knocked down by Chris Arreola in his last fight. Lest we forget, Andy Ruiz approached that fight more fit and trim than he has been in the past, more streamlined, and
Some think it affected his punch resistance.
because he was dropped by Chris Arreola, who at this point has passed it over the hill and is little more than a journeyman. And what makes this fight intriguing is that Charles Martin, comparatively, is a younger man than Chris Arreola, a bigger man than Chris Arreola with a heftier knockout percentage, 80% knockout ratio. 25 of Charles Martin's 28 career victories are 25 victories he won by way of knockout. You ask yourself, If Andy Ruiz can't put away,
He can't knock out a guy like Chris Arreola.
what kind of issues could a statuesque southpaw with an 80% KO percentage give him in Charles Martin? You often hear it said in the sport of boxing that you're only as good as your last performance. You're only as good as your last fight. Well, how good was Andy in his last fight?
Got dropped by a journeyman in his last fight.
So don't kid yourself. There is some intrigue associated with this fight. There is some sizzle. A battle of former heavyweight champions. They say they're trying to do this thing in October. Coincidentally, Canelo Alvarez could be making his next ring appearance in October. And coincidentally, Andy Ruiz fights out of the same gym as Canelo Alvarez, while Charles Martin, he's being trained by Andy Ruiz's old trainer, Manny Robles. So in that way, he's got the inside track on Andy. You know, when Andy Ruiz decided to part ways with Manny Robles, who I think is a pretty damn good trainer, by the way, I had mixed feelings about that, I did. After the loss to Anthony Joshua, I thought to myself, why is Andy parting ways with Manny when this isn't a Manny Robles problem? If you couldn't get your act together ahead of that rematch so you can hold on to those heavyweight titles, that's not necessarily Manny's fault as a trainer, that's your fault as a fighter.
Yeah, he's not a bad teacher. You're a bad student.
At least you were, and he has since had a change in ambiance. The decorum is a lot different. He's fighting out of the same stable as Canelo Alvarez, Ryan Garcia, Oscar Valdez, Frankie Sanchez, these fighters, and maybe, at least psychologically, it's been beneficial for him. But he didn't exactly look great in his last fight, now did he?
He didn't.
Charles Martin, he's training with your old trainer now. The guy who knows what you're good at and what you're not good at. What your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. What you struggle with.
The guy who helped you get those 3 world titles.
That's who he's got in his corner. This is a more important fight for Andy Ruiz than advertised. Make no mistake.
I mean, it's not Dillian White.
But I like the fight, and I have the sneaking suspicion that they're thinking about putting this on the undercard of Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant.
I'm all for it.
It's a decent fight with its own brand of intrigue, and it's got a bit of backstory, so let's see if it materializes.